Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I am John Asack, and this is my great friend, Hoyt Richards.
Nice to see you, John, as always.
Yeah, it's such fun. I was talking with Mike Rinder the other day, and he was saying, it's always such a pleasure to have these conversations. It's like, yeah, I really shouldn't be doing any of this. I'm not making any money from it or anything like that. And,
Well,
and I've not been given a Nobel Prize yet, or any of that.
Yet is the operative word. Yeah.
The operative word. But I can't even think about stopping doing this because I get to talk with my best friends.
Yeah, I agree. I love it.
Yeah. And it's so, he was saying that he finds it stimulating. And I was saying, oh, for me too, there's always something that comes up that fascinates me. And, in conversation with intelligent people,
Yeah, I think it's very healing, because we have this connective tissue of gone through this kind of a shared trauma, so to speak, right? With a cultic experience. But I think once you recognize that can become an asset, and you can share like-minded people who have chosen also to turn it into something empowering rather than something shameful, it really opens up the opportunity to have a lot of great conversations, because I think transparency and ownership of all this history we've all had in different ways is fodder for great conversations and creativity.
Yeah, I agree, and you've segued beautifully into the topic. Well done. The reality is that as members of groups, and my experience was so little, it's so easy in comparison to what you went through. Really was. And in fact, the first time that I saw you was on a chat you had with our mutual friend Steve Hassan.
Right.
And the phrase that came out to me was that you said that having been a member of a cult was a badge of honor. That it was something that we don't have to be ashamed about,
Right.
and something from which there's a great deal to be learned, as long as you're willing to learn it. That's what this conversation is about: the residual guilt of a member looking back at the horrible things they said and did while
Right.
they were in the group, and rather than trying to deny those things, actually accepting that you did do them. And at the one end, I think this is really important. This week been dealing with Alan Shefflin's brilliant the social influence model.
Oh, okay.
And what he's saying is, Alan is an emeritus professor of law who also has a master's degree in counseling, and was also one of the first people to expose the CIA mind control programs, MK Ultra, MK Naomi, in a great book called The Mind Manipulators. And he wants us to say, look, yes, the person's guilty. This isn't a legal framework. They're guilty. Now, can we look at how influence affected this? And then we can determine the measure of guilt. We can mitigate. And I mean, the simplest example of this, and the most horrifying, is Charles Manson and the family. That the surviving members of the family who were sent to prison 50 years ago are still in prison. And the point was made in court at the time that they had come under the influence of Charles Manson. Manson indeed boasted in his autobiography that he'd had 150 hours of Scientology and Dianetic auditing, processing, counseling, and that had transformed him and taught him how to control people. So that's how he learned it.
I did not know that Manson had the Scientology background. I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Writing songs for the Beach Boys because they didn't have Brian Wilson anymore. And two other members of the family had also done Scientology. Squeaky Fromm and Bruce Hines, I think.
Okay.
So, there's that influence. I don't think that's, it's an aspect of what happened. I don't think Scientology is to blame for what he did. And that's not the point. The point is that the court were told that he had controlled these people. They had been coercively controlled. And if you dig out, there's an incredible documentary called Manson, The Lost Tapes. And these are recordings that were made a week after the arrests. A filmmaker went down to Spahn's movie ranch where they had their nest of vipers and interviewed, I think, 5 of the young women, very young women, they're teenagers.
Right.
And they've all had buzz cuts and they've got themselves assault rifles because they're waiting for helter skelter, the war between the races that Manson was so obsessed with. And you really get the mentality that they've been whipped up into. Then
Wow.
that film was made and then put in somebody's garage and never aired. And then it came back to light, and another filmmaker went and found these women and interviewed them these many years later. These, of course, were women who were not arrested at the time, not involved in the murders. And to hear their stories of the way they were treated, they were strays, they were runaways. So you have a woman who's saying, I was 15 and I arrived at the Manson, family, the ranch. And pretty much the first thing that happened was she was anally raped by Charles Manson. So looking at that kind of dynamic happening within the group, why is it, if he had control over them, that 50 years later, these people are still serving time because of, the horror of the crime without the understanding of, so where is the balance of guilt? What are we responsible for?
Right. And where is the acknowledgement, if it's happened, of some recovery and some rehabilitation and some, understanding of what's happened, and being able to, make good on lessons learned, and you can say like that this person is not a danger to society in any way, right? I mean,
absolutely. And
I haven't tracked that case to know where those people's kind of recovery path has been, but you would think you would include that as a possibility of an option for someone, that you can't just damn them for life for decisions made, decades ago, and certainly with influence playing a huge part in it. This is why I love talking about this subject of becoming accountable for what happens in your life, whether you're under influence or not. And I think it's such a huge hurdle to even admit that influence was involved, because, as we've talked about in past episodes, the humility to admit that on some level you got conned is really challenging for a lot of people, even though you can look at us in a daily basis and recognize that we usually get manipulated and conned quite frequently. So you wouldn't think it would be such a huge admission, but people really struggle with things, I think, that come down to their personal philosophy or their spirituality, whichever way they want to frame it, that they got manipulated in that area. I think because it's such an intimate thing that people self-identify with, that there's a resistance to admitting that they basically got taken on some level. And that's obviously the first step you have to go to, but then you have to go down this road of now looking at your life, going back to maybe the first instance when you met this person of influence or a group, and start to take this point of view going forward with this new lens of, from that moment, I was being manipulated on some level, and that played a part into why I did things, why I said things. Or likewise, I know things for me that have been the hardest to own are the choices to not say something, to remain silent because I was afraid of the repercussions of if I did raise my voice, or not to interfere because I didn't want in essence, the mob to turn on me. So all those sort of categories of reevaluating the events that occurred in your life, which may, in my case, amount to decades. I can understand the resistance to not want to do that because that sounds quite horrifying. But the alternative of denying those things and using some form of revisionist history to sweep it under the rug and say, oh, it was all just part of my spiritual journey or my personal growth, and to not acknowledge in clear attention and accuracy that there was abuse and that there was harm going on, not only to yourself, but to the others around you, that you either partook in or didn't stop, whatever way it played out. And that's such important stuff to acknowledge, because that's where the healing takes place. And that's where I have discovered empowerment takes place, from the point of view of the more that I can look at it as a chance not only for me to take ownership, but to possibly educate others, in the sense of saying, you probably think you have an idea possibly of how these things work. Well, let me explain it to you in more detail from someone who actually was there and did some of these exact things you might have heard about. And I'm going to explain to you what my mindset was at that time. And it's not going to reflect very positively on me. But the truth is, by owning it and being accurate, you kind of take the power away from it, and it actually becomes this lesson learned of recognizing that we're all capable of doing things that we never imagined we would maybe get involved with. I mean, certainly going through my experience with eternal values explained to me how a country like Germany got behind Hitler. Like as you know, as horrible as a statement like that sounds, the truth was, it taught me, like, this is how it happens. Like, well-meaning people under good intentions can be manipulated by those very intentions to do things that are absolutely horrific, not only to yourself, but to others. And as we talked about in our last episode, affect everyone around you who cares about you, because you're doing and behaving in a way that people just don't understand, and they suffer just watching you do these things. Like, it seems like it's a different person, and they don't even know who you are when you're kind of in that, under that kind of guise of the mind control and all these sort of things. So yeah, I think it's a really important topic, and I'm glad we're talking about it.
And the beliefs can be very extreme. I mean, our friend Steve Hassan, talking about his 2 years in the Moonies, says, I'd have been willing to kill.
Yeah.
I would have been willing to kill others or kill myself. And here he was, an English major who was going to be a school teacher and wrote poetry. And that, seeing that as it relates to the Germans and Austrians during World War II, that there are so many interesting pieces of information about that when the Einsatzgruppen went through Eastern Europe, murdering Jewish and Romani populations, quite a lot of them refused to pull the trigger. What's called the shower of bullets in the history of the Holocaust. Quite a lot of them wouldn't do it. And it's an interesting reflection. But the amount of instilled obedience, of groupthink, of, if you then amplify that with some coercive control. There's a wonderful book called Zen at War by a man called Brian Daizen Victoria. And his middle name gives it away. He's a Zen priest. So he is a Zen priest writing a history of the Japanese military and how it was trained from the restoration of the Meiji in the 1880s through to 1945. Curiously, after 1945, the Zen teachers moved into the Japanese corporate world, which may explain quite a lot about how different, the corporation man of Japanese society is from the rest of the world, because they are being trained in mindfulness. Oh, I said it. On a daily basis. So the Japanese military found themselves in this position where it was absolutely proper to enslave all Koreans. So in 1910, they invaded Korea, and all Koreans were, you're now slaves. We now own you. And their practice became so caught up in that. And to look at that and say, well, how do you reconcile that with many people leaving Scientology, high-ranking people that I've talked with? There seem to be at one end or the other of a spectrum. And the one end is, well, I was made to do it. I was just following orders. At Nuremberg, that was Befehl ist Befehl. Orders are orders, and it's not accepted as a defense in international law.
Right.
If you do something that's immoral, that is also considered to be wrong. So all of the police officers in the US who've arrested people for the possession of cannabis in states where cannabis is now legal actually committed an immoral offense. There's a curious thing to think about. I tried explaining this to a police officer here, and he just walked out.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I'm sure that rattled the cage. Yeah,
yeah, it's an interesting one. The drug laws are
yeah,
particularly interesting from a moral perspective. You know, you can commit suicide if you want to, that's legal, but you can't take a drug that will supposedly harm you.
yeah,
You can, you know, if you want to eat warfarin rat poison, you can do that. But in this country, you can't own cannabis.
yeah,
It's a terrible bad thing, except it doesn't seem to be, really. But so, you know, that's a, but people would come out and they'd either be justifying it because they were made to do it, it was part of the behavior, or
right.
they'd be trying to take on blame for everything they did. And of course, they did some pretty horrible things.
Yeah,
And you know, seeing that, we occasionally will get somebody like Mike Rinder, who came out and
right.
said, you know, after 6 when he got in Scientology, he was 18 when he became Hubbard's slave aboard the ship, and you know, 20 more years went by. In fact, yeah, it's about 50 when he left, I think.
Wow.
And now, you know, whenever I interview him, somebody will come on and say, well, you know, he hasn't apologized enough. And you're going, but he's admitted what he did. And
Yeah,
he certainly apologized to me for harassing me. And his courage is such, knowing what was going to happen to him for standing up, that he has stood up from, you know, for years now and been honest about it. And here's a man who is accepting that he was at the hard end. He ran harassment against
yeah,
people of Scientology. He said that when the only time we met, he and a team of lawyers and people in sailor suits arrived in the village where you've seen the nice little village where I live.
yeah,
And we had this meeting with all of these people at this table. And Mike said, you know, if I could have destroyed you, I would have done. You seem like a nice chap, a decent chap, but you're opposed to Scientology, so you deserve to die.
yeah,
And that, you know, having shed the mentality, it is necessary, you and I both believe, to accept that you had that mentality. The example you gave before we started recording was the alcoholic who says, well, I was drunk when I ran the person down. It's like, well,
right.
you put the drink inside yourself. With a cult group, the subtle balance is, you know, of how much is your responsibility and how much is the responsibility of the group you belong to. And one last reflection on the Shoah. Some years after the Nuremberg trials in the 1950s, a former SS sergeant came forward and gave testimony about the carbon monoxide trucks that were used to kill people.
Mhm.
And he came forward and he said, I know that by making this admission, it's very likely that I will go to prison. But I have to. What happened was wrong. And he was not tried, he was not sent to prison, which I think
Right.
is quite right in the circumstances. But that sense of shame, that and where people leave something, won't accept responsibility, it diminishes them. It's like that the famous George Bush Senior / John Wayne statement, never apologize, it's a sign of weakness. I think it's
Right.
a terrible sign of weakness not being able to apologize. You
Yeah,
know, not being able to
yeah, I completely
accept the
agree.
responsibility.
Yeah, I think the way you gain someone's respect is to be transparent about your flaws. I mean, who would actually believe in this day and age that perfect beings are walking around flawless and acting in complete accordance at all times? Now,
QAnon.
yeah, well,
Where's the
exactly.
answer?
And actually,
Who in their right
That's
mind would believe is a better way
that's
of
some of
putting
the
it.
BS. That's some of the BS that you get pulled into in this cultic way of thinking. That this is what you're aspiring to. I mean, it's been one of these things that you know, as I was figuring out my life and getting into therapy, you learn that therapy is about recognizing how things you dealt with in your past, and they want to know about your relationship with your parents and all these sort of things, and this idea that, oh, if only my parents hadn't done this and this to me, everything would be fine. And I think the truth is, if you even hypothetically had a perfect childhood with parents that were incredibly loving and empowering and encouraging and told you how much they loved you and hugged you and all the things, if that actually existed for someone's lifetime, who could they have any sort of friendship and kinship with? Because no one could relate to them at all. Like, that is not an aspirational place. Like, parents are just trying to do the best they can. They're dealing with their own wounds and coping mechanisms, which they're projecting onto their kids in some way with usually good intentions. But that's the stuff that doesn't always make sense as a child, getting this information that maybe is contradictory to, I think, parenting often falls into, well, don't do what I did, do this. And you're like, well, wait a second. If you did that, why can't I do it? And so you're sending all sorts of mixed messages. But I think that whole process of recognizing that whatever these things that come into our life is ultimately serving you in the sense, like I guess my faith, for lack of a better kind of description of saying, is founded on the idea that I don't believe we're ever put in a situation we're not capable of handling. That in that sense, the universe is conspiring in our favor to challenge us in ways that we can emerge, hopefully, as a better version of ourselves. In the same way that if you were training an athletic team and you get the best athletes, you don't then just ask them to show up and be awesome. You have to train them. You have to push them. You have to make them practice to bring out their best. You recognize they have capabilities and potential, and you challenge them to see if they can maximize that as best as possible. So I think life is like that, and in the same way, for me, it's kind of like having made the choice to do my best to take accountability for the things that I did and said or didn't do or didn't say that I probably in retrospect wish I had. All those things has given me not only a sense of humility, of recognizing what I'm capable of with in the wrong situation, but it's also given me a sense of compassion and empathy towards others, of realizing just how challenging life is, and embracing that, and recognizing that things like crises is not something to run from, but actually lean in towards, and recognize potentially this perceived crisis is this amazing opportunity for growth. And so I think it's really about encouraging people to say, listen, if you've gone through something traumatic, which I don't think anybody escapes through life not having some major traumas.
We've all been born,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's just, I can only encourage people to take ownership of those things, and find a way by investigating them to determine a silver lining, and to gain the lessons learned there through that process that transformed this thing that may initially appear to have been very negative, and shifted into something much more positive. And there's incredible opportunity there. So when I see people kind of take the choice of, oh, I'm just going to put it in the rear view mirror and just act like it didn't happen, or just not acknowledge it, and that just doesn't seem to be the way trauma works. Trauma will squeak its way in. Like, trauma undealt with finds ways to either replicate itself, or to condition you into doing behavior that's in essence forcing you to acknowledge it. It's like Carl Jung talks about the shadow. You can't get through life without acknowledging that there's some things about ourselves that aren't so beautiful. But the beauty in acknowledging those things is recognizing they're teachers, that if dealt with, they can really teach us. And I think that's, but I understand how hard it is for someone to have to open that Pandora's box and take that ownership. And that's what I recognize happens more often than not, this kind of avoidance and deniability of these events which occurred categorically in our lives, that display ourselves in not the best light, but actually, if dealt with, can actually become something that can be, like I said, a badge of honor. You can be something you can say, listen, I did this, I said this is how I thought, but it taught me. And if that's what it takes to get to the place where you learn, then embrace that process. Why resist it?
Yeah. And I mean, frequently people will comment, we put up The Wonderful Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, which is one of the greatest documentaries ever made about anything, and it's only 20 minutes long. So, and I got it out of Granada TV's archives in 1986, finding that in 1968, this brilliant documentarian, Charlie Nairn, who was 25 years old at the time, had been instructed by Granada to go and find wherever Hubbard was in the Mediterranean. And there was no way of tracking him through GPS at that time. You had to just make inquiries. And he found him in Bizerte in North Africa and did this incredible interview with him. It's the only hostile interview with him. But sure enough, a couple of people have come up and commented how could anybody be so stupid as to follow this man? And you're kind of going, yeah, how could anybody be so stupid as to have let Mao, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler,
Yeah, right.
or for
right.
that matter, made Boris Johnson prime minister or Tony Blair before him? That sort of, it's called, some psychologists call it the just world concept, and it's translated as karma. So whatever happens to you is your fault, which of course is the fundamental of The Secret and the law of attraction and Scientology and Christian Science and many other things. I'm a little concerned about something that you've just said, a couple of things that you just said, and so I'm going to bring them to your attention. The first is the notion that the universe gives a shit and is in any way involved with our development. Unless we take the view that the universe is God or Buddha mind, something like that, I don't really think that there's an interaction going on where I'm here to learn lessons and achieve an enlightened state, which will gradually be brought to me by the universe. My belief. Being an agnostic is a lovely place to be. Nobody can attack me because I don't believe anything. So, and again, the idea of it's perhaps only implicit in what you said, and it may not be what you're saying at all. But the idea that the universe will keep giving you the same lesson until you learn it, that kind of so trauma will keep on going. I think that it's working the other way around. That quite simply, that I will keep getting myself into the same messes because I've been too foolish to understand what's getting me into those messes. So I will keep marrying that kind of woman. And I didn't the last time. I married a really wonderful woman this time who actually, shares enough eccentricities with me for it to work. But so I think we attract trauma so I think what you're saying is true. It's just that I don't think there's any external generator involved here. I think this is an internal process for us that until we learn not to bang our heads against the wall, it will continue to hurt us doing it. And we do tend to follow through these things. The third point is the notion of Jung being right about anything. As far as I'm concerned, Jung and Freud are enemies of humanity. And should be treated very carefully. So the idea of the shadow self, I personally think, is one of the most dangerous ideas in the world. One what Jung and
Oh,
Freud.
I'd love to hear more about your point of view on that. Yeah, because I've always, I mean, and again, I can't say I'm someone who studied Jung. I just always recognized that the shadow was this area that you did not want to admit to. Therefore, it becomes something. It's like basically saying, um, there's parts of my personality that I'll never admit that I'm capable of behaving a certain way. Like I like within the stratosphere of anything that's possible. Oh no, I could never do this or that. I could not kill. I could not lie. Whatever people
Yeah,
may, whatever. And the shadow is this part. Well, you have done those. Not that you maybe kill, but you've done things that are clearly not in accordance with the way you want to be seen. But to say that you're not capable of that is actually almost asking for that behavior to come out. To say, yes, you're also this as well. So that was my understanding of it. Again, I never studied it. I just think it's something that is useful from the point of view of saying, and I just say this from myself and what I've gone through, that we're all capable of things that we maybe don't like to admit, because it doesn't reflect well on us. But I think by taking ownership of those things, we are able to probably have a better capability to not act out in those ways.
yeah.
And I think when you're in that position of saying, "Oh, I could never do that," you like you said, you're kind of you're banging your head against something that's kind of going to probably come back and say, "Oh, maybe you are capable of doing something like that."
I think that's absolutely right. The kind of rosy view we have of ourselves as the most wonderful and sage people is wrong. And we've agreed before that humility is perhaps the most important. Humility and, for me, compassion are the important human virtues, not
Yeah,
intelligence. Intelligence is something that, if you give it to somebody who doesn't have compassion and humility, is a weapon. And we've seen enough of that. However, with the notion of the Jungian shadow, the anima animus idea that you have inside yourself this opposite, the problem with the thought is to express it as you've expressed it. I absolutely agree. We have the capacity. If you take food away from somebody for 3 days, see what happens.
yeah.
They can, and we've got, that wonderful Géricault painting in the Louvre, the Raft of the Medusa, where a friend of mine who was a sound recordist got locked overnight in that room. Yeah.
Oh, really?
And she seemed, I would have been terrified. That painting is, and of course the story is that they ate one another to keep going. And I think there are people who would, it is said of the Buddha that in a past lifetime, seeing a starving tigress, he gave his body to the tigress. And I'm kind of going, well, why didn't you go and get some food for her? That was a bit of a stupid thing. But, I'm a difficult and awkward person.
Right.
But there wasn't a chip shop locally,
Yeah.
But some people would say, eat me.
Yeah.
There are a few people. I'm rather tough, so I wouldn't recommend it. Old and tough. But there are people who'd be quite keen on eating the other people. And I think so. There is a spectrum response, and I think there are some. I think the psychiatrists have this one about right. About 2% of the population are psychopaths. They don't care what they're going to do to you. And about 2% of the people have what I call the empathy disorder. That they're going to go out like St. Francis and kiss lepers and stuff like that. I'm not really sure why he wanted to do that, but we'd have a word for that nowadays. But some people will sacrifice themselves completely to the good of
Yeah.
humanity, and we have a high regard for some of those people. And in the middle is all the rest of us, and
Right.
with tendencies either way. But the idea that's dangerous, I think, in the shadow, in the anima animus idea, in the id superego idea, is that there's an internal agent that you don't know about. Now, what you're talking about as the shadow is understanding that in dire circumstances, you too could do these things. The shadow is something hidden within you. And I think this is the greatest mistake in
Oh,
psychotherapy
I
and
see what you're
religion.
saying. Yeah,
The
I
enemy
see.
within, you don't know what it is, and it's conspiring against you. There is
Oh,
no
yeah,
evidence. There is no evidence for such a thing, even though psychotherapists and religious people keep telling us you've got demons, gadons, dibbuks, whichever language you go into, these
right.
things are believed in. We do have formations and patterns of thinking, and we do act without thinking about them, but there is no unconscious mind as such.
Yeah.
There are unconscious processes. So that,
No,
that's
I
my
think
thought.
no, I think that's a great point, and yeah, not not having studied it like you're describing. I mean, I've heard of those anima. I mean, at some point, I think I had come across it, but that is a very different thing. If you've got this thing that is this lurking behind, you don't know what it could do, and it could spring out at any time, and it's nothing that you could self-identify with. It's like like you're saying, a demon, and that I think is very dangerous. I agree. I'm looking at it purely from the point of view of having had thoughts or having done things that clearly would fall in the category of, yeah, I'm not so proud of the fact that I had that thought, or that I said those words, or that I did that thing, and denying that as like it's that revisionist history thing of saying, well, I would never do that, knowing that you already have done it, or even saying I would never think like that when you have thought like that. And it's that kind of self-denial, I think, is what puts yourself in a very weakened position to just really be empathetic with people, because the empathy comes from recognizing that we're all flawed creatures, and in certain circumstances can do some really less than savory things, and that seems to be part of the human condition. So you're releasing the judgment, because you're able to acknowledge, I've got a version of that myself, and I can see it in someone else, and so I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire on it, other than just for your own sake, hope that you can be accountable and talk about it the same way I'm trying to talk about those thoughts and things that I did. I think that's where the real kind of continuity and the connection can happen, because I've discovered over time, when I have been confident enough to be transparent and take ownership of parts of my life which I exhibited behavior or did things that I'm not proud of, that unlocks another person's fear or shame they're holding around some event or story they have in their life, and now they feel they have permission, because there's safe terrain now, because I've gone and blabbed about this thing that I did and said and was not very proud of, but in doing it from the point of view to try to educate, like, yeah, listen, I did this stuff, but it did teach me, but I did do that, and that gives them kind of the opportunity to say, well, I've maybe never told anyone this, but I had a situation where I did this and I said that, or I thought about this, and then you have these really wonderful conversations, and I think that's been a silver lining that I would have never imagined happening to this process. Because for me, initially, it was just important just to acknowledge something that I was having trouble acknowledging, because I felt like it was an impasse for me to kind of be really honest about who I was and what I had gone through. And so I had spent so much time, especially when I was in my cultic situation, making the choice of being silent, because I was scared, because I didn't want to bring the wrath of the cult leader on me, or the group kind of mob mentality attacking me, or I saw things that I categorically had issue with the way someone else was being treated. It was clearly abusive on some level, and I was afraid to acknowledge that and interfere, because again, I knew that would bring on the hordes of hell from the group. But that's hard to live with, right? To know that you had an opportunity, and yes, I was under the influence. Yes, I was brainwashed to some degree, but you still, those are the type of things that I have found are important to acknowledge. And I think that that choice of being silent has, I've kind of maybe gone to the other extreme of feeling like I'm going to talk about it rather than remain silent. But I've never would have imagined that by talking about it, it started to foster these conversations from others where they now felt safe to be able to confide in someone like myself who was taking ownership of my stuff, for them to kind of take ownership of their stuff. And you have this really kind of safe landscape and terrain to have these very honest conversations about the challenges of just going through life as we do and getting ourselves in situations that can be pretty perilous at times.
Absolutely. In the early 1980s, the American Psychological Association did a study of parenting, and they declared that 97% of American parents were dysfunctional. And my great friend Priscilla Coates at that time had a little cartoon on her fridge where a guy's introducing himself on a date, and he said, "Hi, I'm sorry, I'm one of the 3%." Um, and
That's good.
yeah, I'm not really sure what the APA would consider to be functional or not. I don't consider them to be very functional. So there we go.
Right.
But I think John Gottman, the great couples counselor, he wrote a lovely book about bringing up kids. And he says in it, all right, so your child is about to do something. Find an example where you messed up in the same way and tell them that. Don't tell them not to do it. Don't tell them why they shouldn't do it. Say, yeah, I used to buy Madonna's records or what have you, whatever it is that, and
yeah, I shoplifted or whatever, yeah.
Exactly. Oh, you did you?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I got away with it, and now I'm a multimillionaire, so it's fine. But having that, bringing yourself down from the height.
Yes.
It's a long time ago since I read it. It's 35 years ago or something. But Robert Bly's Iron John.
Oh yeah. Iron John. Yeah, I remember that.
Where he says, when a man is 35, he realizes that he doesn't need to hate his father anymore because he realizes he wasn't the only thing in the world, And
Yeah.
I mean, my poor dad worked himself half to death trying to maintain, 4 kids and,
Yeah.
it was not an easy life that the man had. And he was very distant. I think he probably had Asperger's as well.
Right.
He certainly had been traumatized 7 years in the army through World War II. He was at Dunkirk, he was at Normandy, and he was at the liberation of Belsen in April 1945. So he saw things that gave him nightmares for years afterwards. So he most definitely had PTSD. And yet somehow he managed, and it must come to that point. We can't blame our families, though sometimes we can. Sometimes if they really are blameworthy, there's that there.
Sure.
But even there was a English TV personality called Katie Boyle, who was very famous for a long time. And as it became commonplace for women to talk about how they'd been assaulted as children, how they were being attacked, and things that we absolutely should be looking at in society and changing. But she said, when you get to the age of 35, you should stop whinging. Now, I don't apply that to serious trauma that's been inflicted on people. But when I meet somebody, and I have met people in their 30s, who are still going, this happened to me when I was a kid. Not anything, not, child sexual abuse or anything like that, but they're still upset. I'm still upset about my childhood. I had a great childhood until I went to school at the age of 5, and I hated school. School was this place full of bullies who called themselves teachers, who could hit me, who could tell me what to do, and who did not have my interests at heart and were telling me things that I did not understand and could make no sense of. And I was aware by the age of 17, when I dropped out of school, that I was going to have to sort out what had happened to me. And in the end, that I got into Scientology, so it was fine.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Yeah.
But I've had to think about, the way we teach and that the other aspect of this that bothers me is the idea of redemption. That of all concepts, this is for me the most important, perhaps, that people should be allowed to redeem themselves. And well,
Yeah.
I'm going to admit this, Hoyt. When the death of Ron Hubbard was announced on the day that the Challenger exploded,
Oh,
in 1986, January 86,
wow. I
I
didn't realize.
wept.
Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't get the front of the news because they'd held
Yeah.
it down. So
Right.
when Vaughan
Right.
Young went public and told everybody, he wasn't going to make the front
Put him
page.
back on page 6. Yeah.
Oh, poor Ron. After all those years of working to become infamous, I wept when I heard he was dead. Now, I was not a Scientologist by this time. I didn't believe in any of it by 1986. I'd left in October 83 and I'd stopped believing by around about May 84 or something. So it wasn't for that reason. I just had this awful sense, knowing as much about him as I did, which was probably more than anybody else knew by that time, with the possible exception of Jerry Armstrong. Knowing what I did about him, that he was a man who really needed to be redeemed. And I realized in the back of my mind, while collecting all of this material and publishing it, I had this thought that one day he'd be in prison and I'd go and visit him and we'd try and redeem him. We'd try and.
Oh, I see. I see.
I've grown up a little since then.
So were you weeping over the missed opportunity to have that? Oh,
yeah,
I see.
that he
Oh,
died.
okay.
He died unshriven, if you like.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah.
And I think that we all need redemption, and there's a problem in society, which is it's not allowed. That if you were a murderer, you are a murderer. If you were a child abuser, you are a child abuser.
Right.
And it is very difficult to accept that somebody might have changed. But the reality psychologically is we all do. We start out, we're born with a certain temperament, and that's undeniable, but we will develop character.
Right.
That's up to us to develop.
Yeah.
And so, where somebody is going to be damned forever because they were a cult member.
Right. Exactly. No, and one of the points you touched on, which I think is really interesting and I agree with, is reevaluating how we teach and parent. And I'm not a parent. I'm the fun uncle, and I take that role very seriously. But I've watched my.
I'm glad you're serious about being fun.
Yeah, so absolutely. And because the great thing about being the uncle is I can exhibit behavior and thoughts which give them, my nieces and nephews, an alternative point of view than they're getting from their parents, without having the inherent constrictions that the parents are just trying to do the best with their kids. But I can give them, I can speak more kind of honestly about some of the things I've gone through that allows them to feel they're safe terrain to talk about what they've gone through, right? And because I'm not in that position, which I think is challenging as a parent, to feel like I have to create an example for them that that they're trying, and which may not even be an accurate example of myself, but I get it. Like it's got to be a really hard thing. So I, as the uncle, can say, listen, I was in the cult for 20. That they feel pretty safe coming to me and saying, well, I started to do this or experimented with that, and I'm like, hey, I get it. I tried this, I tried that. So I find those conversations to be really, really helpful. And I think the approach that you talked about is, being able to kind of meet them where they are. It's like, I remember hearing that, a lot of children struggle with swimming because they're being taught by an adult. They're looking at this huge human who's telling them that they can float and these can, but if you have kids of the same age as them doing the swimming, that has a much more powerful effect on them to have the courage to go swim. It's like, oh, someone my size is doing what this person's telling me. Oh, I can do it too. Why not me? But when you've got the giant telling you as a little kid, oh, this is what it's a much more difficult thing. So that same dynamic, I think, when we try to present ourselves as someone less flawed than we are, we're doing a disservice in a way to really have a constructive conversation with someone, to meet them where they are and to say, yeah, listen, we all make mistakes from a certain point of view, but you can also call those lessons. So ultimately, as athletes say, trust in the process, right? Like you're on the learning curve. That's what it's about. Failure usually teaches you more than even wins. So it's this idea of starting to recognize that the world isn't black and white. It's really shades of gray, and there's no inherent right or wrong. The real key is do the best you can. You're going to make a choice because you're faced with choices all the time, and even not making a choice is a choice. So whatever you do or don't do is in some way going to inform you, which is going to potentially teach you. So just keep doing the best you can. And I think it's the denial of the so-called failures or the shortcomings never serves you. The reverse, the ownership. I know it sounds counterintuitive. That's what actually gives you, in my opinion, the opportunity to present yourself more accurately, which will give you the impression of being more present and more genuine to someone, which fosters a more healthy conversation.
Yeah, and I think that hiding, your experience, pretending that you didn't do things, actually is a process that interferes with being present, with being alert, with being
Right.
really in the room.
Yeah.
And because people are so, and I think to some extent this does become unconscious. As I say, I don't think there's an agency running the unconscious
Right.
mind,
Right.
but I think, and I don't want to get into reaction formations and ideas like that, which are way too clever for me. But that we will, if we cannot admit our wrongdoing, let's call it that, our transgressions, if we can't admit the things we've done that actually violate our own moral codes,
Right. Yeah. I think it's a good way to frame it. Yeah.
then it will diminish us.
Yeah.
And we find that, I mean, an interesting point about teaching, just as we got to that and having somebody the same size, there was work done, I think Ken Robinson talks about it. I think that's where I saw it, where they have this thing where rather than having the lesson and then showing the video, they showed the video and then had the lesson. And the kids that got what the video was teaching would then teach the other kids rather than a teacher. And they found that this was much more effective. I know when
Right.
my son Sam was at school, he is incredible at mathematics. And so in every lesson, he'd have finished his work and would then spend 20 minutes going around the other kids and helping them. And certainly from talking to those kids, they got it when he explained it.
Yeah.
A teacher can get further and further distant from the communication with
Exactly.
pupils.
Yeah.
And now you're at the top of you're at the front of the class and we all sit here, and the whole way that education is constructed, the most attentive pupils I have ever seen were members of the San. They're somewhat insultingly called the Bushmen of the Kalahari. They aren't of the Kalahari. They were driven there when the Zulu expansion into South Africa happened. They were pushed over by the other peoples who were between them, and they ended up in the desert. So they've not been there for thousands of years, but they've worked out how to live there, which is incredible. And I saw this little documentary, and there was a San elder crouched down on the ground, and there were a group of 8 or 9 kids looking at him, and they were completely fascinated. I have never seen that in a schoolroom. How awful. And what he was doing was he was showing them the different animals they would encounter, and he was mimicking an ostrich, for example. And it was absolutely mesmerizing, and it reminded me that the teaching experience should be absolutely mesmerizing. rather than boring as hell.
No, it's true. And, and it, yeah, I noticed another thing with kids that, and I'll be curious to get your take on this, because I remember I went up to Nantucket one summer with my family vacations, and a lot of times my siblings are all there. So, I've got 16 nieces and nephews, so it can be a huge pack of kids, and they were quite close in ages, and I just remember there must have been, at least at this time I was out there, probably 10 of them, maybe 12, and they were all maybe between 4 years old and 8 or 9. Like that was about it, and maybe not even that old, but they were watching 101 Dalmatians.
Yeah.
And they watched it every night for the 7 nights I was there, and captivated the entire time. And, and of course, I found that fascinating, because I'm like, well, what are they seeing differently each time? And then it finally hit me. It's like, no, it's the fact that they know what's going to happen. They spend so much time being overwhelmed by the world with not knowing what to expect, because each day is so different. There's comfort in watching something and knowing what's going to happen, because that's not what they're experiencing much in their life at this stage.
That's
and I
a
thought,
good point.
oh, I said, this is fascinating. Like there's comfort in that, not having to be surprised all the time, And I thought, I don't know if you agree with that, but I thought that was my kind of epiphany of the way I assessed this captivatingly. They just, they were just all heads watching the same thing, and they'd watched it 6, 7 nights in a row, and they just loved it.
Yeah, the Cruella de Vil show. My daughter Lizzie, the age of 3 or 4, started obsessively watching Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which I'd never seen, and I don't think I've ever sat through it all, but I've seen it all, because
Van Dyke, of course, yeah.
this didn't go on for just a week, and finding the story behind it. Ian Fleming didn't care about his James Bond books. This was his project, and it is a very subtle and clever piece of work. But as you say, that it gave a familiarity, and that's the point where I learned, and it's about 1991 or something, that you can treat a movie in the same way you treat a song or an orchestral piece. You can treat it like music. You can go back to it, and I do. I mean, I've watched the whole of 6 Feet Under 7 times.
Oh, really? That's great. Okay.
And it every year or two, I'm going to come back to it, because it's a masterpiece. The same with The Wire. Say, I've watched that 4 times. I'm rewatching Boston Legal for the 4th time.
Oh, yeah.
And you learn so much about the craft, and how it's done. So the first time you watch a movie, you're the suspense, the what have you.
You're having the experience, right? Yeah.
Second time, you can get into things that you didn't necessarily see the first time. Especially if it's a Kurosawa or Wells or somebody wonderful. But
I do the same thing. I look at a movie first time as best as I can, because I'm a filmmaker, as an audience. I just try to leave what I know knowledge
not be commenting on it as you go.
Yeah, exactly. But if I have this great experience, then I'm fascinated to go back and say, okay, why did it work so well? And I think it's a great process doing that.
But I do think you're right that I'm significantly and seriously worried about device world. We talked last time we talked, and I don't think we were recording, but you talked about the idea of having a kind of R2D2,
right?
That would photograph everything and have your memories for you, so you could it would be your personal droid,
right?
And I suggested during that conversation that we'd already become cyber integrated, and there's a book by Dr. Karl Marcy, who Steve interviewed, who's a psychiatrist who's been looking at attention. And one of the things he said that really horrified him, as when smartphones came along, he was working for an international advertising consortium, and they wanted to see the extent to which the interruption of the smartphone would affect whether people were watching the ads on TV. That kind of, simple
Oh,
bread and butter question. What got him was that there was one woman, and some people had their smartphones taken away and some didn't. And they're being paid, I think it was $150 for the hour. They could leave anytime they wanted to, and they'd still get $150. And one woman, he said, as he was watching her going, once she'd put down her smartphone, she was becoming agitated, and he could see this. And I think she lasted about 10 minutes or something, and she had to get her phone back. She
wow.
didn't take the $150. She couldn't be away from it. I am seeing that. I'm currently reading Gloria Mark, Attention Span. Gloria Mark spent more than 20 years studying attention in the wild, as she puts it. So rather than having, how long did you pay attention to
Yeah,
this in
right,
a
right,
lab?
right.
She's putting heart monitors, actigraphs onto people and seeing through the day when they open their email and how much time they spend doing whatever. And she's saying, what I found, you already know, that our attention span is diminishing, that our
Mhm.
ability to focus is diminishing. And,
Yeah,
she makes one brief positive comment about mindfulness based upon one study. Well, I'm not really very interested in things that are based upon one study. I need two at least. I need a replication. And I don't think that mindfulness meditation is the way to, give us attention. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. Having been a meditator since I was 17, and having
right,
learned the
right.
Zazen meditation, all that. And I personally found it very useful. I don't do it anymore because it's about focusing attention. I can now do that. I don't need to sit
Yeah,
down for 20 minutes a day and empty anything out or do anything. I can focus at a
right.
moment's notice, luckily. But that control of our attention that is fundamental to mind control, that is fundamental, the idea that our attention can be hijacked and that we're now actually, we've jumped into the river without learning to swim.
Yeah, yeah.
And so,
And yeah, and it's such an accepted behavior now. I mean, it's I mean, and there's no doubt I have addiction issues with this thing. There's no doubt,
mm,
that I deal with, and I find it's even a tool if I'm going and meeting someone in a social environment and they aren't there and I've got like time to kill, I get self-conscious and I go to my phone. Like that's rather than like look around and maybe engage someone or whatever, I could be intimidated by the situation. And I'm like, oh, well, I'll just be on my phone. That's accepted behavior. Like I've got someone I'm talking to, and so, yeah, I agree. I think our attention span is it's a and I guess I wonder like how much of it is even conscious, and I think that's an interesting question. Like how aware are we of, and I guess we have to rely on our friends to kind of say, I think it's getting a little out of control or not. Because
but our
I
friends are
think,
probably doing the same thing.
yeah,
It's that, and she does come to, I've entered the subject, so I'll say a couple of
yeah,
other things. She questions the notion of flow, which has been so popular since that Hungarian man whose name nobody can pronounce,
yeah,
since he came up with this thing and pushed the idea that we should all be in this flow state all of the time. We should be in the
right,
zone. We should be pumped and what have you. Well, if you're doing athletics or painting a picture or writing something, then flow is a
yeah,
useful state. If you are writing an auditor's report on the company finances, it's not. And she also points out that we need breaks in attention and that we take them naturally. That's what she's found. And there is, so she talks about Maya Angelou, the great novelist, and says she would hire a hotel room to write in. And she would go there same time every day and she would write. But when she couldn't write, she'd have a pack of cards and she'd sit down and play patience or something. And then she'd go back to writing.
okay,
Maya Angelou described this as big mind and little mind. And she found a balance whereby she was able to work. And certainly as a writer, I'm very familiar with the, no, what am I going to say? Sort of
Yeah.
feeling. And I
Right.
overcame that in my 20s. I was very lucky because I play the drums and I paint. And I managed to set up a room so that I'd got my computer. And when I couldn't think of anything else to say, I'd turn to the 6 or 7 paintings behind me and put a dab of paint on them or go and play the drums. And I found that quite naturally I
Right.
could get an awful lot of stuff done, and I didn't sit in the dumps. You know, most writers have this writer's
Right.
block. I never
Right.
really had that. It's finding the time to say all of it for me, as you know from talking with me. Um, but that coming into control of our attention, and I haven't got to her recommendations yet. You know, I'm in the first 100 pages of the book, but over the weekend, I'm working on a chapter with Steve Hassan, who seems to be coming up in this conversation an awful lot.
Yeah.
And I, on Saturday, my wife Pamela was away for a couple of hours doing something. So I sat down. And the thing that was different, and I know about this, the thing that was different was I didn't look to see what my channel statistics were, and I didn't look at my email. I went, the important thing for me to do is to write this chapter. So, in fact, I drafted the chapter in 2 days over the weekend by just saying,
Yeah.
there's a writer here called Paul Abbott. He's known for Shameless in both the
Yeah.
US and UK versions. I'm not sure about the US version. The UK version's brilliant. And he did grow up in a family, in fact, of 10 children with a
Oh,
drunken
wow.
father who is, he said when he showed his dad the first episode, his dad said, you know, he's lying about drunk. He does nothing to look after the family. And his dad said, when did I ever have long hair? So he comments about it. But Paul Abbott says he has a room in which there's a computer which is not connected to the internet. There are no books, there are no magazines, there's nothing. When he goes in there, he works.
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
just that simple tip of coming back into control of your attention and you being the person deciding what you're going to do. Nothing at all wrong with sitting and looking at your phone. My kids, one of my brothers said, you know, they spend too much time on the internet, your kids. I said, no, they don't. They are just pulling information into their heads. They're not
Yeah.
playing games, and even
Yeah.
playing games is okay within a certain confine of
Right.
time. But they are their access, you know, I say something to them and they're immediately, no, you're wrong, Dad.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
awful.
No, it's true. It's true. It's like an information source. It's remarkable. I've got a nephew like that. I mean, he is just constantly pulling information out of the phone. I mean, that's just his, and you know, yeah, you could say that's maybe a healthy addiction. I don't know. I mean, but it's clearly it's like having, you know, I remember, you know, growing up as a kid, the encyclopedia, right? You always kind of, but it's like having the encyclopedia on steroids in your hand. I mean,
Mm.
it's an incredible tool.
Yes, it is. I've made a few
You-
notes as we've gone along. Let me
Yeah,
touch upon them.
please.
I brought up Brian Dye's Zen Victoria and his book Zen at War, and I didn't say what I was going to say, which is
Okay.
there's a story in there of 2 Japanese soldiers who were asked to join in the regular practice of bayoneting Chinese civilians who were tied to trees to death. And
Oh
this
my
was,
God.
you know, it's a way of toughening people up so they'll be willing to do horrible things. And this guy refused.
Oh,
Imagine this, given the nature of the Japanese military. And he said afterwards, I could not do it. I knew that I was now risking my own life, but
wow.
there was no way I could do it. And he then watched in horror as all but one of the rest of the troop murdered Chinese civilians.
Wow.
But they'd all done their mindfulness meditation, so they did it compassionately.
Mm.
So totally weird. We,
Interesting.
we're talking about vulnerability. So that's to say that there are a tiny amount of people who are resilient and resistant, and we
Mm.
should try to be like them. I think we should
Right.
try to, you
Yeah.
know, at least, you know, there's a thing called the Stetson effect. A member of the famous Hat family who during the terrible racism in the US of segregation, Jim Crow. He said, well, look, if you dare not complain about what the racist is saying to you, don't smile at them. Don't add
Yeah.
anything to it.
Right.
The other thing was on, I only have one note here that I haven't got to. Isn't that incredible?
That is good.
It's on the idea of vulnerability, that to admit vulnerability is to admit that you might be vulnerable. And I've talked with many people who, like me, recruited people into cults. Everybody I recruited left, and about 10,000 more, I'm happy to say. So I think I've made up for that just about. But the people who are easiest to recruit are the people who are sure they're not vulnerable. They're really easy to recruit. That was my experience. So I used to find people who had a bad experience of Scientology and were complaining about it, and I would then recruit them.
Oh, fantastic.
And that vulnerability is, I wondered, for years and years and years, I've been doing this, 39 years I've been doing this. And why is it that people don't want to hear? Why don't they want to know about issues of coercive control? Why are they so sure that they can't be wrong? And a couple of years ago, it struck me, if I disbelieve my own perception and interpretation of the world, then everything could go wrong. So I have to believe in myself and that perception and interpretation until such time as I become an adult, which I expect to happen sometime in my 80s. When we actually grow up, I think there's that point that it comes where it's like, yeah, I did these things wrong.
Yeah.
All of the pride and the sense of self that attaches to that diminishes as quite naturally as we grow older.
Unless you're a politician, right?
Yeah, in which case it just seems to invert somehow. And I think there are a few rare exceptions to that, and I'm very pleased that there are.
I hope so. I don't know of any in America, but I like to believe they're out there.
Yeah, I think you do. I think there are people. I think the problem is that the system makes it so difficult to be a decent human being. One part of it being that you'll be worked to death. If you're a politician, you won't sleep properly, and you'll have to. I'm quite impressed with Jamie Raskin, who was on the January the 6th committee, who's a representative. He seems to me a highly decent and honourable man. But the problems that we get into, where the ego gets in the way, that power tends to corrupt, absolute power, absolutely so. That doesn't matter whether you're male, female, trans, or whatever. Power tends to corrupt. And when somebody's got authoritar, as Cartman calls it, they will tend to have a preening opinion of themselves and tip over into narcissism. So, I mean, for me, one of the bizarre episodes was John Kerry when he was standing for president. And I think he is probably a decent man. I don't know. But there were two things that bothered me. One was that he was given a gun at one of the meetings he addressed, and he said he'd go and shoot some gobbles with it. Now, this is a man who had voted for restriction of guns repeatedly and every time. So that seemed a little bit, rather than going, don't want that. Right. The other thing was that he had a marquee where people could go and talk with him, and you had to have donated $100,000 to his campaign. And that point, your politicians are having to always keep a weather eye on whether they're going to be re-elected. We only have the infamous torture report about Guantanamo Bay, which Barack Obama refused to release because the two senators who'd put it together had both finished their office. They were not seeking re-election. So they went, we've been torturing people. Here's a 500-page report. So, but politicians.
Yes. But I agree with the vulnerability thing, and Brene Brown has written a lot about that. Basically, the cure to shame is vulnerability.
Mhm.
And obviously, when you're vulnerable, you take ownership of your story and tell your story as honestly and as accurately as possible. And I think when you display that type of courage to be that vulnerable, you possibly encourage others to join you in that space and have, a wonderful conversation. So, I think taking it full circle, this is what I think is the biggest challenge of a recovery process, is to go to that vulnerable place and admit to yourself those things. But I really believe it pays off, and it's the work that's most important to do.
Yeah, I agree with you that we have to re-estimate who we are and
Yeah.
what we've done in the world, and accept that we will probably never become perfect.
Exactly. Which I embrace 100%. I don't want to be perfect.
No,
I wouldn't have any friends, and you would just, everyone you would meet would just be like, "God, I can't stand being around that guy." Who wants to be that person?
yeah, it does worry one about what
Yeah,
conceptions of God might be in human
yeah,
beings.
right, exactly.
Seems
Yeah.
to be a psychopathic monster for most of them, I fear. I
Yeah.
want to be worshipped all the time. That's what I like, okay.
Oh, that's great. Well,
Okay.
John, it's always great to see you,
Yeah, likewise.
and until the next time,
Yep,
keep holding the faith.
we will.
Yeah.
The faith shall
All
be
right.
held.
That's
Great,
right.
fantastic, Hoyt.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care, brother.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.